Niall Ferguson argues that we are all Soviets now. His articles stirred controversy, with many people nodding that the comparison between the United States' decline today has strong analogies with late Soviet Russia. Many people are disagreeing, and some are saying his analogy doesn't go far enough. He's soft-pedaling the problems. Today, Nikos and I are going to unpack Niall Ferguson's viral essay and expose what the buzz around it completely misses. The essay is more revealing than people realize, and in ways that they're significantly overlooking. So drop us a comment if you've read the essay, or share your take, and post your questions. We're going to track them as we do this podcast today. If you're new, please subscribe to the channel and like the video to get more incisive comment from the perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism here at the Ayn Rand Institute. Welcome, Nikos. Let's dive in.
Let's dive in indeed.
All right, so three major things we want to talk about today. Let me just lay them out. One is, why is this essay so important? Why has it stirred so much controversy? Next, what is his argument and what to say about that? And then finally, what are some of the issues that he's trying to process, but that maybe he's not understanding properly, and what is the critique that we're offering? So let me hand it back to you, Nikos. What is your take on this? What do you think is important about this essay?
So here's the main thesis of the essay. The main thesis is that the United States is in a new Cold War. A new Cold War, this time against China. But as opposed to Cold War #1 against the Soviet Union, from which the United States came out victorious and the sole superpower in the world, in this Cold War, the West, the United States, might be on the side of the losers. So we imagine ourselves as still the most dominant power, Niall Ferguson says. But what if, in this war, we are not the United States, we are the equivalent of Soviet Union? And he creates this very powerful image. He says, imagine this American ship, warship in the Pacific. It is sinking after a military confrontation with China. And the two sailors bring in mind this line from the famous British comedy, "Are we the baddies?" But in this time, they say, "Are we the Soviets?" Which means, are we on the losing side? Are we on the weak side? So this is the argument by Niall Ferguson. He's ringing a bell saying, we're becoming weaker and we are actually might be losing.
So let's lay out a bit the significance of that. So he's not just some guy with a blog. This is Niall Ferguson, who is an accomplished historian, celebrated. He's had academic positions at Harvard and at Oxford and many other places now. I think he's at Hoover Institution. Now, important is that, as I said earlier, this essay with that very controversial claim that you were outlining has stirred a lot of controversy. So there's commentary about it from Ross Douthat, from Journo Goldberg, and people who are saying this isn't right, this is wrong, or people saying this is really interesting, or he doesn't really go far enough. There's an essay, I think it was in Unheard, by Helen Andrews, saying he doesn't even know how bad it is. It's way more Soviet than he's even willing to allow. And then people who are, I think, really thoughtful, like Paul Graham, who's in the startup phase, which is really surprising to me. He reposted this essay with a reflection on that. Now, we'll come back to why that's significant, but this is just to paint a picture of Niall Ferguson is a really significant public intellectual, and he's writing this in the Free Press, which is a publication that started recently. And I think they're trying to position themselves as a home for non-establishment perspectives, for challenging assumptions. So I think this is part of why it's interesting to look at the reactions to it, and that this is a significant position that he's staked out. So you've just given us a capsule summary of his basic claim. Why don't we dive into it and see what is the analogy, what are the points of contact as he sees them, and then we'll unpack a bit what is going on in this argument. So maybe you can tell us a bit about some of the elements of this claim. So he says that we're in this new Cold War, we're the ones who are weaker, we're not going to survive. What else is going on here?
So why might we not survive this Cold War? And by survive, he doesn't mean we're going to be annihilated. He means the United States is going to retreat from the dominant role it has in the world. Now, why retreat? The main reason he puts on the table, one of the main reasons, is that the economy of the United States is unimpressive. The United States is running on huge budget deficits, and this means that the United States cannot sustain its dominant role in the world, what he calls the role of an empire. So he mentions that this will be the first year that one of the first years where United States will spend more on financing its debt rather than on spending on defense. So what he's claiming is that China is spending a lot on defense. China has modernized its army. China is ready for war in terms of its economy. Also, he mentioned we've seen that the Russian economy has been on a war footing for 2 years now due to the war in Ukraine. But the United States is not able to do so and will not be able to do so for some time. Therefore, he claims we are literally not ready to get into an economy which will mobilize resources, that will restock artillery and many other details that he lays out. And this means that for the foreseeable future, the United States will be weaker its military will be weaker than many of us might have thought. And he draws the parallel with Soviet Union. How did Soviet Union collapse at the very end in the decade of the 80s? It overexpanded. The United States entered in the Ronald Reagan years in the Star Wars project. To put simply, there was a lot of spending from the United States in defense, in military technology, and Soviet Union could not follow. And at the same time, Soviet Union had to fund its satellite states in Europe. At some point, because it was a stagnant economy, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of carrying a whole empire. It could not anymore be an empire because it did not have the economy of an empire. And Niall Ferguson says this is where the United States is now. We think we are in an empire, but we don't have the capacity, the economic capacity to support this role as an empire. What do you think about that, Elan?
Yeah, I want to just say up front what I think is going on here, which is that I think it's useful to think about historical analogies for where we are. And I think there is truth to the claim that the United States is experiencing significant declines. But I think ultimately what Niall Ferguson is doing here is really misconceived. I don't think he intends it to be this way, but what he says is a compliment to the USSR and an insult to the United States, this idea that we're really essentially like late Soviet Russia. And I would say that the basic complaint I have is that it's anti-intellectual, anti-ideological, and both in the content and the method. But I think to get to that, it would be useful to lay out for people who don't know a lot about the Soviet Union, what is the history there? What is he trying to activate as a context? And I think it's a really grim one. So maybe you could just sketch out for us what you remember for that as part of your understanding.
Right. So Soviet history, we could divide it into three periods. The period of the revolution and then the period of Stalin. This is the period of, let's say, revolutionary aspiration, idealism. Of course, idealism projected to the useful idiots in the West, because within Soviet Union there was famine and terror. But at least there was the idea projected abroad that this is a country on the rise, something new, a novel experiment is taking place here. Then after Stalin, and with the glory of the victory in World War II, we had the period of Khrushchev, where Soviet Union establishes itself like as a global power. But this period does not last long. In the 70s, and even more in the 80s, we have the period of stagnation with leaders like Brezhnev and then old leaders like Andropov and Chernenko, who stay in power only for a few months each because of their frail health. And this was a period where the vast majority of the population was completely demoralized. No one, including even people in the leadership of the Soviet Union, but even more the population, no one believed anymore in the official narrative that this is a country that is building socialism and communism, that something new is being tried here, and that this country is on its way to glory. So there was a lot of cynicism. Obviously, there could be no opposition because opposition was not allowed, but opposition was expressed through retreat. People who withdrew in their private lives, many withdrew to despair, alcoholism. And it was a society that there was this stagnation. No one expected anything. And at some point, there was one fiasco after the other, the defeat in the war in Afghanistan, and even more the Chernobyl in 1986, which showed to the whole world that the king is without clothes. So when someone like Gorbachev came to power, trying to move Soviet Union away from this stagnation, the whole system collapsed. So this is the image that Niall Ferguson, an image of stagnation, an image of cynicism, an image where nothing happens, no one hopes, and no one has any hope about anything, and the whole world knows that this is not a big power. This is a country which is slowly collapsing.
One of the things I took away listening to you, and also just from reading specifically the particular claims that Niall Ferguson is making, what came to mind is Donald Trump's inauguration speech from 2017. Many people remember it as the American Carnage speech. And that's because he paints a picture of the United States as this destroyed, ruined society. It has this post-apocalyptic feel to it. And Donald Trump says this is going to end now. And what I take from this late Soviet analogy that Ferguson is bringing up is a very similar narrative of America's really not just in decline. We're basically at the bottom. We're really suffering. And he brings in, as you were making the point here, a lot of economic points about the way in which the society is weakened. I think it's important to stress, and this is the part I want to dig into more, that Ferguson thinks of his basic claim as driven, the economics of it are driven by political, social, cultural factors. And so he wants to bring in some of these cultural war type issues as perhaps as explaining it. It's not really clear. The argument isn't really pointing to causes. It's more pointing to a diagnosis rather than what's underlying it. So I want to explore this a bit more and just acknowledge that yes, there are elements of decline in the United States, and I think we've talked about that in different podcasts in the past. I think the analogy is fundamentally wrong, and it's wrong both in its method, and I want to focus primarily on the method he adopts, and I think that leads to problems in the particular claims, the content that the conclusions that he comes to. So let's talk about some of the elements of disanalogy, because I think anytime someone's making an analogy like this, it's natural and important to think, well, is this really right? Does this cover all the facts? Is this really exhaustive? And how strong is the analogy? How illuminating is it? And I think the answer is it's not at all illuminating, even as I think we will continue to acknowledge in this conversation that America has suffered declines. So let's take what I think of as a major problem in Niall Ferguson's approach, which I think he drops the context fundamentally. There's a massive context that one has to think about, and he's not bringing that in. So what is one significant thing that's fundamentally different about the United States versus late Soviet Russia? The first thing that came to my mind, and then there's a whole string of them, but the first thing that came to my mind is the whole Silicon Valley startups phase, all the progress that's happened in the last even just 10 years or 20 years, however long you want to open that horizon. You're in Athens, I'm in California, where this wasn't possible 7 years ago, to have a podcast where we're live streaming high quality video. Now, what has made that possible is individuals and companies investing significant thought and energy, because they're free to invest thought and energy in new technologies and to push forward the boundaries of human knowledge and the possibilities of applying that knowledge to new goals, such as video conferencing like Zoom and other platforms. Late Soviet Russia had anything like this? I mean, as you put it, I forget if you put it earlier in the conversation, or it was just before we started the live stream, but I think you said that stagnation for the Soviets was the best you could expect. And so that's nothing like what we experience today. And in the many ways in which our lives are materially and also intellectually better than they ever were, I think that you can't have an article about American decline where you're making an analogy and not acknowledge the major areas in which it's just not true. It's not true. And I think the other place, just to name them briefly, is biotechnology. And the advances, I heard a lecture this summer that really dazzled me in the different kinds of technologies that are being developed to cure diseases, to alleviate suffering, and that people don't know about, but they're happening and they're going to happen. And would they happen faster were there not as many controls? Yes, of course, that's true. That's the perspective we take, that freedom is the facilitates and enables progress. But even with all the lack of freedom that we have, there's just part of our analysis of what's the decline in America. There's just amazing new technology. Think about CRISPR and the way in which they can modify people's DNA, basically. I'm sure I'm not capturing that as scientifically accurately as possible, but that's just mind-boggling. And then we are really passionate about the importance of freedom of speech here at the Ayn Rand Institute. It's an issue we've talked about for many years. Even with the ways in which freedom of speech have been eroded in the last 30, 40 years, and we've been at the vanguard of pointing that out and fighting to reverse that, it's still true that America has freedom of speech in significant ways. That can't be said of late Soviet Russia. People were struggling, fighting, risking their lives to get out of Soviet Russia. And that's just not true of the United States today. People can speak. Ferguson is complaining about America. Could people sit around and complain in the way that he's doing now? I think eventually they were able, because the Soviet Union started collapsing and they weren't able to enforce it. But just think, technology, biotechnology, freedom of speech, the flourishing of human knowledge that's happening right now, that nothing like that was true and could not have been true in late Soviet Russia. So I think that's a significant point of disanalogy. I want to throw it back to you. What kind of things did you notice as this? I mean, if there were things like that from reading Ferguson's analysis.
Well, let's put it very simply. The history of the United States is a history where, up to the point because United States fundamentally leaves people to be free to pursue what they want to pursue, is a history where progress is the rule and some periods of crisis here and there is the exception. For the Soviet Union and for any other unfree society, the rule is stagnation, misery, famines, horror. And every now and then there's a period of exception where there is some form of prosperity, which is always a result of a bailout by freer societies. We saw that in Soviet Union with the humanitarian help from the United States in the early 20s, the Western investments during the era of the Great Depression, and so on and so forth, to the point where Soviet Union or similar countries are relying on themselves. The result is misery. So the rule, the norm for such societies is stagnation, misery. The rule, the norm for societies, for free societies, is prosperity. So a culture and a society like the United States needs a tweak in the level of ideas, people appreciating what makes such a society possible. And then the way to glory, the way to prosperity is a very short one. There is no such tweak that you can apply to a society like Soviet Union, maybe even to a society like China today. So there's a lot of discussion about the problems of the United States, and reading Niall Ferguson, it's very easy to get depressed about the state of the world, but it is not that China is this model society that people around the world can't wait to either migrate there or adopt the Chinese model. So there's too much pessimism, but Ferguson would say that this is something intentional. He would say, I would want to make sure that all people wake up. And this is why he used also the language of Soviet Union. And let me tell you something, Elan, it worked. We are discussing this essay. This essay sparked a lot of discussion. So Ferguson would say, because indeed this country is very important and special, I just wanted to trigger a discussion around it. So this would be a sympathetic reading of what he's doing.
I agree. He's succeeded in provoking an important conversation. I don't agree that I question his motivation. So I question whether he really thinks America is exceptional. I think part of what I take from this, and hopefully we'll get into this more, is that he is moving towards the kind of view that we hear a lot of, which is that it empties out America of its ideological distinctiveness. It empties America out of its intellectual substance. And in the end, what that means is America becomes just like any other country, both politically and intellectually. So it's no longer America in the sense of a country founded on the idea of individualism, the idea of individual rights and a government designed to protect the freedom of individuals as an ideal. it's remarkable what isn't in his article. There isn't any recognition of America as a really significant country. I don't think there is that. I mean, maybe that is Ferguson's view, but it's not part of his view in the article. And it's surprising to me that we hear so little about the ideas that define America and the ideas that defined the Soviet regime. And I think this is a remarkable point, because I think this is another perspective on something you said earlier, which is America is deviating from an ideal that it could get back to intellectually and politically. The Soviet Union wasn't deviating. This was the dead end of its ideas, and this is why it ended up the way it is. So we can fix where we are. The Soviets, there was no remedy except for it to collapse. That isn't at all something that emerges from Ferguson's perspective. And I think this speaks to a deeper philosophical aspect. So I've highlighted one way in which his methodology is broken. He's dropping a significant amount of the context and just not really thinking about the phenomenon fully. I think another feature of another problem, I think, is just it's an anti-intellectual, anti-ideological perspective. And I don't mean that in the sense that he's silly or stupid. Not at all. I think he's very intelligent and knowledgeable, and I have a lot of respect for Ferguson. But I think what his essay exhibits is, you might say, it's a blind spot to ideas or the role of ideas. So here's part of why I say that. So the article pivots from, we have all these economic problems, we have all these political problems. Look at the leadership in America. Look at the leadership in the late Soviet Union. And then it's, well, my fundamental point, he says, or my deeper point, this comes out in some of the interviews he's done, is, well, look at the cultural, social issues. Those are the really significant things that we need to address or to think about. But very little is said about that. And insofar as he talks about what are some of the social, political, cultural issues in America, it's the conventional conservative perspective of people are losing sight of, they're no longer interested in family, having children, and community involvement. And what we do have, and I think there's truth in this part at least, that there is an ideology in many institutions and in government, the diversity, equity, inclusion type perspective, the woke perspective, and he's right, I think, to react to that. But insofar as what he thinks America is, it's just not, it's so wide of the mark. This is not what drove American progress, what drove America to become the freest country, that we were collectivized and religious and community oriented. Now, there's value in community, but it's not in the sense that he's activating it. And I think that the kind of perspective he's bringing forward is one in which it drops out the distinctive character of America, both in its genesis and in its present state today. So you made the point about individuals having autonomy and being able to do a lot of things to overcome problems in their lives, and that's a significant part of what's still true about America today. You don't get that from Ferguson. It's as if he's insensitive to the vestiges of freedom that I think I and you are really committed to building up and bolstering, as opposed to overlooking, which I think is what is going on in Ferguson's perspective.
Let me make though this claim here, because I made it in our discussion before we went live. So let me mention it also in terms of what's the context here. One of the strongest arguments that Ferguson makes is about the deaths of despair in the United States. All the people dying from suicide, drug overdose, fentanyl, or the people in the 10 cities in California. And Ferguson makes the claim that there has not been a single country in the modern history of humanity where you see such a sharp decline in life expectancy for a part of its population, except from what we saw in Soviet Union in its last years. So he makes the claim that these deaths of despair is a sign of a moral collapse of a society. And therefore, he says, we are a society which is in a sharp decline. Now, here's why I think there's a big problem when you compare deaths of despair in the United States with deaths of despair in Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, in some ways, despair was warranted. There was nothing someone could do to lead a good life, to chase their dreams, to have a goal and go after it. It was either escape in the West, or then the best you could do is be a bootlicker in the party, and then maybe you get a semi-decent small apartment, and you get some coupons that you get some meat every week. That was as good as it gets. In the United States, although indeed, as you said, we understand that there is a moral crisis, maybe the crisis of what are the ideals and the values in this society, and we are fighting in that front. We are manning these barricades, and we've been doing it for decades. But still, in the United States, you can still be something. You can do something with your life. You can chase your dreams. And this is how a society fights back. And this is how a society becomes great again. It's not by giving a lot of birthing many children or whatever I'm listening to these days. There's the National Conservative Conference, and there are all these ideas that this is the way to go. We need more children. No, first and foremost, we need good ideas again. And this is how a society becomes prosperous. This is what made the United States a model in the world. They saw that people there can chase their dreams. People there can create cool things. And this is what is actually needed also today. And this is still possible. Yes, there is in academia, there is this atmosphere of intellectual orthodoxy with bad ideas. And again, we're fighting these bad ideas. That's the whole point of the Anwan University and of what we're doing here. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it is still possible in the United States to do great things, which was never the case in Soviet Union and will never be the case in China. No one is going to China to chase their dreams. No one is going to China to pursue their great ideas. So this is a major issue where Niall Ferguson, as you said, has a blind spot. Indeed, it's quite concerning why so many people are morally lost in the United States. But this does not mean that as a society, it's a failed society or it's a resemblant of Soviet Union.
So let me emphasize another aspect of this. So I think that in Ferguson's perspective, there is a blind spot to the role of ideas, or a blind spot might be too charitable. It's devoid of a significant concern with ideas and ideology. And one piece of evidence for that is he says in passing that the Chinese are committed to Marxist-Leninist ideology and that they're very communist. And I don't think it takes deep knowledge of China to understand that that's just not accurate. I don't know why he thinks that's true, but that's just not. I mean, reading the newspaper, you would get that what China is about is much more about control than it is about ideology. They've drained the Marxist-Leninism out significantly, even though it's a very authoritarian regime. So that's concerning. That's one piece of evidence. The other kind of piece of evidence here is when we think back to the argument you described in his article about the United States versus China and the roles are reversed and we're the Soviets and the economic concerns. There is an element there of the Chinese are going to eat our lunch, basically. They're going to dominate, and how are we going to get back? And there's a very collectivized perspective there, which is we need to treat the Chinese as our enemy. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about China. I don't think they're the same reasons that Ferguson has. The idea that he's pointing to China as the most concerning enemy and a cause for concern in every dimension, economic, social, political, and measuring us against them. Part of what I think makes that tribal is that he's pointing to an outside force for us to rally against. This is often what you see with tribal thinking. That's the reason we have to unite. That's the reason we have to rally America. I don't think that's valid. I think you have to understand what's going on with China. You have to prepare for it. You have to strategize. You have to have a view of it. You have to understand the ideas that animate them, and he evidently does not understand those ideas. But the undercurrent of his argument is pointing to an outside force as a threat to us, and that as simultaneously the way in which you rally people. And that's tribal. That's not orienting people towards what's actually the basis for having a confidence in America and a confidence in the future and a willingness to achieve things. So I think that's revealing of the absence of ideology and the concern with ideas in this article. I just want to say one other thing about Ferguson, which this leads to other points, but I just set it up and I'm interested in your reaction to this as well. So I'm arguing that methodologically in his approach and then in the content of his approach, it's non-intellectual and it's got elements of tribal thinking and trying to rally people around that. I think that the doom aspect of this whole article. It's like, look how far down we've gone. This sort of really reveling in how bad America is and overstating it, as you're making the point, compared to late Soviet Russia, nowhere near as bad, even with all the problems that we can admit. So, but that reveling in doom and what I was characterizing as echoes of the Donald Trump American carnage speech, that whole perspective that we're like the society in some apocalyptic movie, that's just not true to the facts. And when that is what you're pushing, what I think is trying to activate fear in people, and fear is not this is what demagogues do. This is activating fear without concern for what is the cause and how do you solve it. So I grant you he's activated a conversation, but I think that there's something unsavory about the motive here of stirring up fear in an exaggerated way. And I think when you instill fear in people and you leave them without intellectual direction, and you orient them towards a tribal kind of rallying, that's preparing the ground for authoritarian leadership. Like, we'll solve this for you. We'll beat China. We won't let them eat our lunch. And this is the sense in which I think Ferguson he seems to be moving towards that element of the conservative movement that is creating some intellectual respectability for authoritarianism. So you mentioned the National Conservatives earlier in the conversation. I've written about them, and I think part of their agenda is to create more intellectual respectability and to retrofit authoritarianism on top of America. Now, I'm not saying Ferguson is exactly that, but I think he's moving toward that. And that's part of what's so distressing. Someone this intelligent and this accomplished is giving up. I think this is just not the path forward at all. And it's going to destroy freedom rather than foster any renewal, if that was at all part of his agenda.
Yeah, so, and to defend Ferguson here, he in follow-up interviews, he said, I don't think the solution is authoritarianism. He doesn't even think the solution is a trade war. He said, I'm an Adam Smith classical liberal. In a podcast with Goldberg today, he said that the solution is more individual freedom. But notice something, right? There is no solution offered in the article. So here will come the populist and he will say, look, all these people who talk about liberty, the liberals, these people have failed. These people have no solutions. We have solutions. So the situation is that there's a bleak darkness of pessimism and someone needs to impose a narrative of hope. And it has to be our narrative. We have to go forward also with a positive vision, the vision of creativeness, individual rights, freedom, and all these things. And obviously a vision of having a strategy in the world arena. Because notice the other interesting thing, the other weird thing with the so-called neoconservatives. On the one hand, they're ringing the bell that United States is in retreat, in decline. And at the same time, it's very unclear to me what they're trying to do. What is their goal? How do they see the role of the United States? Is it the guarantor of democracy all over the world? Is it any of these altruistic visions? So there is an identification of the problem. As you said, it is often a misidentification, which is problem number one. And problem number two, there is a lack of any possible solution, and even taking them on their own word, there is no solution that they are suggesting. So this is the problem at the end of the day. Indeed, there is a problem, but the problem is misidentified, and there is no positive vision from the side of the Niall Fergusons of this world. Unfortunately, there is a solution from the side of the authoritarian right, of the new right. I hope Niall Ferguson is not going that side, because as you said, he's a respectable and good intellectual. But there needs to be a positive vision from the side of the good guys.
Yeah, and I want to just bring up one final thought here, which is to the point you made that there are problems, and some of them are misidentified, some of them are accurately identified. I want to flag one that I think is a significant problem, and it's part of what he brings up, which is the decline in trust in institutions. So government, Congress, different levels of society, including institutions like universities. I think that is true, and it's measurable in polls. It's measurable in people's attitudes towards government, towards Congress, towards the presidency, towards universities, towards the media. I think there's a lot of that going on. I think it's largely warranted, not always warranted, and sometimes the kind of people pushing against the trust in institutional or the respect for institutions, they have malign goals. So I think that we have to distinguish between the valid concerns and some of them that are being trumped up. This, though, is another example of the way in which Ferguson is draining ideas out of the whole context here. So I agree that there's been a decline in institutional respect, and one piece of that is post 9/11, the military and the government and the lies that were told. And what is the point of the U.S. response to 9/11? Why go into Iraq? We've talked about this in the podcast. We've published books and articles about this issue across decades. And that's a valid concern. I think people have reasons to think, why are we trusting these people? Why did we go to Iraq? Why did we go to Afghanistan? What happened in 2021 when we withdrew from Afghanistan? Everything reset to where it was before the Islamists are back. You can see how that would erode, if not completely destroy, people's ability to respect institutions that are important. And I think institutions are important. And the same thing is true for the financial crisis and COVID more recently. I think we had a question here about the lockdowns. I agree. The lockdowns are something we opposed. I think that's a significant blow. And there's a lecture that our colleague Yaron Brook gave this summer that draws on this issue of the decline in popular trust in institutions. And I think that's a significant problem. Ferguson talks about that, but I think he gets it really wrong. He completely ignores the nature of the problem. So take the example of Afghanistan, which he mentions in passing as part of his comparison with late Soviet Russia. So the Soviets were defeated in Afghanistan. America was defeated in Afghanistan. That's part of his analysis. We've spent years explaining and pointing out that the Afghanistan debacle, and including Iraq here, and the US response on it, is not a fundamentally military failure the way that Ferguson is portraying it, and the way in which I think it probably largely was for the Soviets. It was a failure of ideas and policy, and it's a philosophical failure. It's a failure not to have a clear conception of the nature of the enemy and the purpose of the mission and what it looks like to uphold American self-interest in foreign policy. That's a fundamental ideological, political, and ultimately philosophic failure. I'm not faulting Ferguson for not getting that point. I'm faulting him for not thinking about that issue and just treating it at a surface level. But I think that is further evidence that ideas just don't have a reality in his thinking as causal factors. And I think this prevents him from succeeding in understanding American decline. And as a result, what we get is this analogy that's just not at all persuasive and not illuminating. And I think it does more to obscure the nature of the problem, such as, why are there elites who succeed and are able to have affordable healthcare, and then all the non-elites, as he puts it, who don't, and they're suffering? Well, you have to think about the nature of government and its mixture of socialist elements, or Soviet elements, and its mixtures of freedom. So as Ayn Rand put it, there's a mixed economy, and that creates all kinds of distortions, which Ferguson is oblivious to. And as much as I heard him say that he's an Adam Smith free trader and he's for individual freedom, none of that comes through in this piece. And none of that, I think, is alive in his analysis. Because if it were, he would approach this, I think, very differently. So this is further evidence that I think if people are viewing this as, oh, he's cherry picking, that's part of the methodological problem. He's dropping the wider context and he's picking examples that he thinks are going to be effective. And the best, I think, most charitable approach to that is maybe he sees his goal exclusively as raising an alarm. But I think that's irresponsible. I think he needs to be thinking more deeply about this issue so that he doesn't become an accomplice to this sort of the foundations of authoritarianism. As much as he opposes that, he should be more conscious of that. So to me, that's part of why it's so disturbing, and I can see why people reacted to it, even if they don't identify all the concerns that we're identifying here in this article. So no, we're not the Soviets. That's nothing close to what's true, even as there's significant and ultimately philosophical decline in America, and that needs to be addressed. And the way to address that is to take more seriously the role of ideas, not to play it down, which I think is the ultimate criticism here of Ferguson.
And my final word would be that you mentioned the issue of ideas. in some ways, the previous Cold War, or the actual Cold War, was decided on the level of ideas. I was having a discussion with a dissident from Eastern Europe who was bringing VHS tapes of Chuck Norris in socialist countries. So you would say Chuck Norris is not an ideal, but it symbolized something to these people, that this is America, this other place where these amazing things, like learning karate, whatever, is possible. So, and as long as the Soviet Union could fool its population and could fool the useful idiots in the West that it was this new experiment and this idealistic society, it had some prestige, and this prestige gave it a base to stand on. When this base was removed, the Soviet Union very quickly collapsed. So ideas do matter, even on the level of whether you're going to win a Cold War versus another real or imagined superpower.
Because we should draw a line here. Thanks to those of you who are watching and posting questions. We always are excited to see your questions. We'll try to get to some of them. I think we addressed one thing about the lockdowns, and I think where can Americans go for freedom is another question. I think the fight is still here. I don't think the time for Americans to seek freedom elsewhere has come. I think there's plenty more opportunity to advance and reinforce freedom here. And I'm unlike Ferguson, perhaps I'm not as pessimistic as he. And I think the final thought I would have is that this is another example for me, another object lesson in the importance of philosophy as a tool for understanding the culture, and that when you drop that tool, you don't consider it as a powerful tool, it leads you astray. And I think this is where Ferguson is. He's not taking advantage of the power that philosophy can offer us. And the result, sadly to me, is that I think he's creating or fostering the kind of mentality that is necessarily a barrier to pushing America towards a better future. So he's fostering the kind of ideas and mentality that doesn't view America as exceptional, doesn't view America as a positive value to be defended, and the need to understand what that is. Consequently, how much can people possibly expect to rise up if we're just as bad as the Soviets, if not worse? So I think if his goal was to raise the alarm, it's not the outcome I think he's hoping for, because while the alarm is important, unless you point people towards what needs to be done, what's important, and what the positive values are, the ideals, it reinforces fear, reinforces decline, and the feeling of doom and despair, which he's decrying. So I think there's a way in which the danger of his kind of articles is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Look at all the decline, look at all the despair, look at all the suffering and the weakness. Well, if you kick people and tell them there's nothing to fight for, what do you expect of them in return? That you're readying them for some authoritarian, even if that's not your explicit goal. Any final thoughts from you, Nikos?
No, you just, I remember I'm misquoting Milan Kundera, pessimism is the opium of the people. So that's my final thought. So yeah, we need, pessimism doesn't mean that you're better prepared to face the future. You need to have a positive vision to face the future.
Good. Well, thank you all. Thanks for those of you who submitted super chats. We appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Leave your questions and comments in down below in the video. And we welcome your feedback. We love to hear from you. You can always write to us, newideal@aynrand.org. And we'll see you next time.